perfect. Thank you. So, I do appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning and to talk to you about an issue that is really near and dear to my heart because of the work that I've done for the past several years. But let me introduce myself. I'm Patricia Warth. I'm co-director at Justice Strategies at the Center for Community Alternatives. And the Center for Community Alternatives mission is to reduce our reliance on incarceration and promote reintegrated justice. And we do this through the delivery of services, through advocacy, and through policy development. And I have to say that it's our direct services in working with people who have pending charges and are facing possible incarceration, and working with people who are seeking to reintegrate into the community after contacts with the criminal justice system. It's this work, this service work, that drives our policy work. And it's this service work and the experiences of the people with whom I've worked and our clients that drives my testimony here today. I know that Mr. Huffman talked compellingly about the cost benefits of regulating and taxing marijuana instead of continuing on our current course of criminalizing it. And I was very impressed with what he had to say about that. I'm less of a numbers person, so I'm going to talk to you today about the human costs of continuing on our current course of criminalizing marijuana, and hence the human benefits of abandoning that course and choosing a much more productive course. It's hard for me, after several years of working with people who've had contacts with the criminal justice system and who face constant barriers to living a law-abiding life because of their conviction, it's hard for me to overstate just how hard it is to move forward with your life when you have a criminal conviction. And this is true no matter whether the conviction was a misdemeanor or felony conviction. It's true whether you served many years in prison or whether you didn't serve one single day in jail or prison. The barriers are the same. And so to talk about them, I'm going to talk about them in human terms through the eyes of a young man I will name William. William is 20 years old. He's a high school graduate. He's smart and capable. But William, like a lot of young people, uses marijuana. What happens if William is arrested and convicted because he used marijuana? Well, we know that one obvious consequence of this arrest and conviction is possible incarceration. And what do we know about incarceration? Well, incarceration isn't going to encourage and promote William living a law-abiding life. If anything, it's going to yank him from his supports in the community. It's going to yank him from his family. If he has a job, it's going to yank him from that. If he was in college, it's going to yank him from that. And it's going to plump him in this environment that by its very nature is dysfunctional and prioritizes control and violence over healthy responses and a healthy way to live. It does not promote rehabilitation. We know that now about our prison system. But it will make things more difficult for William in terms of reintegrating into the community. But once William is done with prison, or assuming he doesn't even have to go to prison, assuming his conviction is for a low-level felony or for a misdemeanor, he doesn't have to serve a day in prison, William's punishment is not over. Indeed, it's just beginning. Now remember, William's smart, graduated from high school. Let's say that William was in college at the time that he was convicted of marijuana possession, and let's say that he was receiving federal financial aid. That financial aid, he will be ineligible for it. If he can't pay for college otherwise, he will have to drop out. If William decides to apply to college moving forward, according to research that CCA has done, there's a high probability, because most colleges now require applicants to check a box on the college application indicating whether or not they have a conviction. Colleges frown upon drug convictions, I don't need to tell you that, and he will face barriers to admission. So higher education is going to be a problem for William for the rest of his life. He will always have to check that box. Let's say that William decides to get a job instead of pursuing higher education. Well, I can tell you because of the work that we do focusing on employment issues for people with criminal history records, despite our anti-discrimination laws in New York, employers do discriminate. That's a reality. Most employers include a box on the application requiring you to check yes or no if you have a conviction, whether it's a misdemeanor or a felony. If you check that box, what do you think happens to that application? And I have to tell you that our people who are applying for jobs and being persistent over and over again are faced with this discrimination, and they give up after a certain amount of time. It's demoralizing when you know that no matter how qualified you are, how motivated you are, the mere fact that you check that box is going to create a problem in terms of getting a job. This problem that William will face in getting a job, again, it will last the rest of his life. He will always have to check that box on the application. So again, that would create a problem for him. What about housing? Again, this will create problems for William. If William is living with his family and they're renting from a private landlord, chances are that the private landlord will use New York's body house statutes or common law nuisance theory to try to evict William and his family. So William will have to elect to move out so that his family doesn't get evicted. But then he will have to try to rent on his own. And again, most landlords do criminal background checks. And most landlords frown upon drug convictions. So William's going to have a hard time renting an apartment from a private landlord. He's going to spend a lot of time couch surfing, right? But let's say that William's family lives in federally subsidized housing. Here the situation is just as dire, if not worse. Federal law allows public housing authorities to terminate the residence of or to exclude families if one of the family members has a conviction, a conviction involving drug-related criminal activity. Marijuana conviction is defined as a conviction of drug-related criminal activity. Chances are that William's family will be evicted from their subsidized housing if he does not move out. If he does move out, he will not be able to get federally subsidized housing with his conviction in most cities with public housing authorities. Just as an example, in New York City, his conviction in a misdemeanor, a low-level offense, a misdemeanor, will exclude him from eligibility for public housing for 3 to 4 years. If it's a felony, it will be 5 to 6 years. And of course, his sentence can extend out this period. So again, William will face barriers to housing for most of his life. What if William is not a citizen of the United States, was not born here, but has lived here lawfully most of his life with his family? Well, we know that drug convictions, including marijuana convictions, carry some of the most serious and unforgiving immigration consequences. And since marijuana is considered a controlled substance under federal law, these consequences apply to marijuana convictions. If William was not born in the U.S. and has not become a naturalized citizen, his marijuana conviction will almost certainly result in him being deportable, banished from his country. The only exception is if the marijuana conviction involves 30 grams or less of marijuana, but that doesn't leave William free of immigration consequences. What that means is if he leaves the country, he likely will not be readmitted. He will be inadmissible. So again, even small amounts of marijuana can result in significant immigration consequences. And I want to emphasize this. We've had clients, and I've consulted on cases of lawful permanent residents who have lived in this country most of their lives. Their entire families are here. They even served in the military. And yet they are rendered deportable because of the drug conviction. And this applies to marijuana convictions as well. One of the things that breaks my heart, and I get lots of phone calls about this, is the inability to even do volunteer work because of the drug conviction. And I can't tell you how many phone calls I receive from parents. Parents saying, because of a conviction, a drug conviction, a minor drug conviction that I had when I was in college, I can't volunteer at my kids' play. The school tells me that I can't be around children. Schools tell this to parents because of the drug conviction. And CCA was recently asked to render an opinion to the USA, the United States Track and Field Association, on their policy creating outright bars for people to volunteer as coaches or track officials in youth programs because of convictions. Outright bars because of a minor drug conviction. So even people who seek to contribute to their community, who really try very hard to give back to the community, face bars because of the drug conviction. And this is true for marijuana convictions. The consequences of conviction permeate all aspects of a person's life, and I've only touched on some of them. And worse, they last a lifetime. There's no expungement in New York. Once you're convicted, misdemeanor or felony, it is on your record for the rest of your life. And if asked, you're required to disclose it. In a 2006 report about the consequences of a criminal conviction, the New York State Bar Association Special Committee on Reentry emphasized that these consequences erect significant barriers to the ability of a person to lead a full and dignified life in the community. So William, 20 years old, talented, capable, user of marijuana, if he's arrested and convicted, he will forever face barriers to living a full, dignified life in the community. Well, what we also know about this issue and about William is the likelihood that William will be arrested and convicted for using marijuana, and thus have to endure these lifelong consequences. This likelihood depends significantly on whether William is white or black. The ACLU recently released a report called Marijuana in Black and White, which illuminates, I think, even when I was reading it this past weekend, I was surprised at some of the facts. For one, I didn't realize that this is true. The rates of arrest for marijuana have increased in the last decade. As police have focused on lower-level crimes and federal government has incentivized marijuana arrests through criminal justice spending. Today, most, 88% of marijuana arrests are for simple possession. For people like William, who just use marijuana. They don't sell it, they don't promote it, they're just simple users of marijuana. In New York, this percentage is even higher. 97% of marijuana arrests in New York are for possession. New York ranks as the state with the most marijuana arrests. These arrests account for nearly half of all drug arrests. And young people are often targeted for these arrests, with 62% of marijuana arrests involving people aged 24 or younger, like our William. In the United States, and in New York in particular, the war on drugs has really become a war on marijuana. But this war on marijuana possession has not achieved its goal of diminishing marijuana use, as you already said earlier. And between 1980 and 2000, marijuana usage remained steady. What's interesting is in the decade where we targeted marijuana arrests, use has actually risen slightly amongst older people. In other words, the data is pretty compelling that our policy of criminalizing marijuana doesn't deter its use. But what about the issue of whether William is black and white? Well, our own research, our government's own research tells us that the fact that William uses marijuana is pretty much race neutral, right? Usage of marijuana tends to be the same between black, white, and Hispanic communities. Yet nationally, blacks are nearly four times likelier, more likely than their white counterparts to be arrested for marijuana. And I want to emphasize this point. This is not a Southern problem. This issue actually is most pronounced in the Northeast. In the South, the likelihood of that if William is black and he will be arrested is 3 times more, right? In the Northeast, it's more than he's more than 4 times as likely to be arrested if he's black as opposed to a white William, right? My own home country, or county, Onondaga County, is one of the counties in the nation with the highest marijuana arrest rates for Black people. Race matters. If William is white, he's no less likely to use marijuana, but he's far less likely to be arrested for his use. Because he's less likely to be arrested, our white William is far less likely to face barriers to nearly all aspects of living a dignified life in the community. For over 4 decades, we've persisted in a policy of criminalization over regulation of marijuana. This policy hasn't reduced the use of marijuana. It hasn't affected it at all. It's a failed policy. But it's not merely a failed policy, it's a profoundly harmful policy. It has destroyed lives, it has torn apart families, it has ruined communities. So one cannot help but wonder why we persist in a failed policy that has such negative impact. But I think when you layer in the racial impact and the significant impact that our policy has had on communities of color, this question of why we persist takes on a whole heightened moral imperative. I think that abandoning the failed policy of criminalization is long past due, which is why I welcome this bill that seeks to regulate and tax marijuana. I also urge this committee to recognize the harm that has been done by our 40 years of failed policy and the need to repair those communities that have endured this harm. And so I ask this committee to consider, in terms of the money that's generated from taxing marijuana, instead of putting that money into the general fund, I think that that money should be targeted to education and healthcare in lower income communities as a recognition of the harm of our failed policy. So I thank you for this opportunity to talk to you. Do you have questions?
Thank you. I just want to say that your testimony is sort of a break your heart kind of testimony, that in case anyone wasn't really clear, that there's real harm being done to real people, even from, sometimes I hear from my colleagues who don't get this, well, they're just getting hit with a violation or a misdemeanor. Really, what's the big deal? And I really appreciate you being able to so articulate that it's a huge deal, that we are ruining people's lives for their entire career because of something we might have done involving a couple of marijuana cigarettes when they're 16 years old.
I don't know where this comes from. I've actually, a colleague of mine actually spoke at a public forum about re-entry issues, and there's a law enforcement officer there who kept insisting misdemeanors do not create barriers to living a law-abiding life in the community. And she's pulling her hair out because it's like, we see it. We see it every day in the work that we do. We have clients who sole contact with the criminal justice system led to a misdemeanor conviction over 8 years ago, and yet they can't get a job because of it. So I think there is this illusion that lower level offenses, violations, and misdemeanors don't create these barriers, but they are very real for people who have to live their lives with this stigma.
Well, thank you very much for your testimony. I agree with you. A senator that does, make it live, makes it facts live, and just knowing that the 5 million Americans named William, whose lives are negatively impacted, who eventually will be needed to take care of by some form of government service because they're unable to take care of themselves because they've been prohibited from going to college to an hours-based economy, from getting a job, from having a place to live. Essentially end up either homeless, their man, or their family. So this is an issue that has a human face, and you definitely put it on here today. So thank you very much.
And just that part of the human story, I went through 4 years of college, 3 years of law school, and the most marijuana use I ever saw were the rich white kids that were attending college with me and in law school. And these kids weren't being arrested, they weren't being convicted. And then you mentioned the discrimination by employees. There's currently a bill, law in New York State that says that you're not supposed to ask about criminal convictions unless it's directly related to the job at hand. And the reality is that the law is circumvented time and again. And so that's why I proposed with Senator Ruth Thompson an amendment to the law that adds more teeth to it, and we haven't been able to get out of the Senate. However, that is a major problem, and I think the reason we proposed this bill is because we thought that it would help some of these young kids that commit knucklehead moves and smoke marijuana get caught, so that they can't suffer the consequences of having this conviction and having employers ask about that conviction.
I think that's absolutely right, as long as the question's on the application, and, you know, that will always permit employers to not follow Article 23A, the anti-discrimination statutes. If it's taken off the application and the inquiry is deferred, then you can re-bring Article 23A to life in New York.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Our next testifier is Gabriel Sayegh from Georgia Policy Alliance.